welcome to episode 41 of Radicals in Conversation, the monthly podcast from Pluto Press, one of the world's leading independent radical publishers. It's been a bit of a longer break between episodes than usual, so welcome back. We'll definitely be making up for lost time over the next couple of months, so stay tuned for a double bill of Radicals in Conversation, probably in June. I'm your host Chris Brown, and I'm excited to be back in the home studio today with another really amazing guest, Leah Cowan. Leah is the former politics editor at Galdem. She works now for Project 17, an advice centre which supports migrant families with no recourse to public funds. Her work focuses on the intersections of race, gender and migration, and she's written for Vice, Open Democracy and The Guardian. She's also the author of Border Nation, A Story of Migration, which is a fantastic new book out now from Pluto Press. So our discussion today is going to be all about borders, their history, whose interests they serve, and how people are actively resisting them today. We'll also be talking about the compelling case for border abolition. As ever, podcast listeners can get 50% off the book through plutobooks.com for the next month, using the coupon podcast at the checkout. It is a fantastic book at a great price, so I strongly encourage folks to check that out. Now, just before we dive into today's discussion, it's time for me to give a quick shout out to Pluto's newest Patreon patrons. Yvette, Aoife O'Brien, Victoria H, Luke, Aristides Quintilianus, Julia Omapas, Lake MacDonald, Louise Barber, Alex Spice, and Rochelle Russell. So a big thanks to all of the above for your membership and to all of our other patrons who continue to offer their solidarity each month. Check out the Patreon member benefits if you haven't already. You can get big discounts on print books, free ebooks, merchandise, and the full-length versions of this podcast. Just go to patreon.com/PlutoPress to find out more. All right, so without further ado, let's get back to today's discussion with Leah Cowan, author of Border Nation. So yeah, thank you very much for joining us today, Leah. Appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let's start off with something pretty basic, I suppose. What impelled you to write this excellent new book, Border Nation, and who is it for? Who's your intended audience?
Yeah, I think a couple of different things. I've been working in the migrants' rights sector and what in the UK is called the women's sector or the gender-based violence sector for the past decade, I guess. And alongside that, kind of doing grassroots organising in the UK feminist movement and the kind of no borders, anti-deportation, anti-detention movement here. And I suppose, my kind of work and political organising combined to produce my kind of interest on this topic and wanting to bring together information in one place about the different elements of Britain's border regime, as well as the giving a bit of information about like the colonial underpinnings of the border apparatus, as I feel like that's sometimes a bit of a missing part of the conversation. And the book is for everyone. It's for as many people as would be interested in reading it. I think I wanted to write something which felt relatively digestible, and a kind of common piece of feedback is that the book is very accessible, which is great. That was definitely the intended purpose. I wanted to create something that would be interesting to people who perhaps, knew a bit about Britain's borders, whether through their own lived experience or their own research or work or organising, as well as people who have no kind of particular grounding in border politics at all, but maybe a bit of a prickling sense that this idea, this myth that there are some people that deserve to be here somehow and others that don't, doesn't really stack up. So the book is designed to present information for all of those audiences and beyond about Britain's border regime, how it came to exist and what the impacts of it are, and the fact that we can work together to kind of dismantle the border.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give a quick shout out to the Outspoken by Pluto series, which the book is within, and to Neda Tehrani, who's the commissioning editor on that series, because all the books in that series, ostensibly it's I guess for younger readers, but actually the thing that you said about them just being accessible books is really the main thing. I've read every book in the series and they're all fantastic and they all speak to one another as well really nicely. So if you haven't already looked at the other books in the series, do go and check them out, because they're definitely fantastic. So Yeah, the title of the book is Border Nation, A Story of Migration. Can you say a little bit more about what's entailed by this idea of the border nation, quote unquote? So what are
Mm.
its origins and what's the story of its development, really?
Well, borders, the idea of no borders actually isn't a brand new idea. It's borders themselves that are a
Mm,
relatively new concept. So even in the late 19th century, most of the world's borders could be quite freely crossed without a passport. More specifically, Britain's immigration laws, which I suppose provide the blueprints for the enforcement of borders on British soil, could be said to originate perhaps with the 1905 Aliens Act. And there's a great book by Nadine El Anani called Bordering Britain,
mm,
in which she explains how the Aliens Act primarily targeted poor Jewish people who were categorized as aliens who were seeking protection from persecution. But prior to, around 1905, laws had been passed in countries that were colonized by Britain to stop people from traveling from the colonies to the central hub of the empire. And I think what this tells us is that Britain's borders are, of course, a fiction ostensibly created to shut out racialized people from the UK in order to protect the interests and the capital of the rich and powerful. And we can conceive of the way in which Borders upholds this idea of racial capitalism, which was
mm,
coined by Cedric Robinson. He describes it as the idea that capitalism is an economic system reliant on the accumulation of capital, and capital can only accumulate by producing and moving through relations of severe inequality among human beings and groups of humans. So, this is the kind of racist foundation of borders, the fact that they exist to protect the interests of capital. But from kind of 1905 onwards, immigration laws very much continue the bordering project. We have the British Nationality Act in 1948, which is often pointed to as the key moment in the country's migration history, in that it gave the status of British citizen to all Commonwealth subjects and recognised their right to work and settle in the UK and bring their families here. And this is, of course, what leads to what is known as the Windrush generation of people coming to the UK very much as citizens.
mm.
And then we have the right to reside in the UK being restricted 23 years later by the 1971 Immigration Act. And from that point, the right of abode can only be claimed by people who have a prior link to the UK. So people who have like a parent or grandparent who was born here. At that time, that basically just means white people. So, even just these few examples show us how borders are this relatively new concept of the past 100-ish years. And we can very much see why they exist and how they start to harden and who they are bordering against. Prior to this, I think there's little concern about borders in the same way. Perhaps this, I don't know, could be attributable to the relative immobility of most people, travel being quite expensive. In
Mm.
the modern day, there's obviously lots of reasons why people migrate, including wars and environmental degradation, and to escape poverty or economic stagnation, often the result of Britain's neo-colonial interventions. And in response to this, we see bordering happening in step with the expansion of racial capitalism.
Mm. I mean, that conjures up for me the line from Sivanandan, we're here because you were there.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear a bit more about that actually, like the role of colonial education systems and curricula themselves. Because I think you say in the book, there's a reason why people from, say, India or from Caribbean countries have historically come to Britain. They
Mm,
don't just arrive here at random.
yes.
Um, yeah, could you say a bit more about, I guess, education in the colonial context?
Yeah. Well, it's very much I mean, this is a kind of simplistic analysis, but I think it's a very much double-edged sword of part of the colonial project was about Britain going out into the colonies and saying Britain is wonderful and being speaking English is the best thing you can do when we have this great religion and you should, behave in the way that we do and read Shakespeare and John Donne and, this is the way to be the best type of human you can be, and very much exports those Anglo-centric ideals, in every aspect of life, whether it's education or, arts, literature, beauty ideals, anything like that. The idea of that, to an extent, is to kind of keep people in their place. But then, as you've just outlined, the impact of that is that people can speak English and people can kind of come to the UK and perhaps access the jobs market in a way that they wouldn't have been able to if that colonial education system, of course, incredibly violent in that it kind of sought to wipe out languages and histories and knowledge bases of other countries. Um, it provided this kind of weapon that could be subverted and used as an entry point into the UK. And yeah, I kind of pull on a couple of examples of that in the book.
Mm. So you kind of mentioned a bit about the jobs market there already. One thing that comes through in the book is like how Britain seems to go through phases of being very hot and cold about welcoming, I guess, migration, with certain strings attached always.
Mm.
And it's very much based on what's going on in terms of the economy at the time. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think I suppose one of the more recent examples is around the expansion of the European Union and how in the rhetoric around Brexit, a lot of people are worried that, we've had free movement and now there are going to be these borders between Britain and Europe. And those borders have always very much existed for working class people or people that don't have wealth.
Mm.
And we can see that in how Operation Nexus panned out. So this was a joint operation between the Home Office and the police, and it was about targeting rough sleeping Eastern European migrants effectively,
Mm.
because there was this kind of sneaky bit of guidance that was put out that said if you were rough sleeping, then you weren't exercising your treaty rights, which are the things you need to be doing to kind of be in the country as an EEA migrant. So that was kind of used as a way to target and deport vast swathes of, rough sleeping, working class Europeans back out of the UK effectively. So I think that shows you how, even if it seems that a border has kind of opened up, you might be welcomed here if you can bring your labour here and if you can help to make the country richer. But as soon
Mm.
as you're perceived as not towing the line with those obligations, the border very much kind of comes at you fast in a way.
I guess we'll talk a little bit more about like deportation and immigration detention and so on in a little bit. But just to go back for a second, yeah, you refer to Peter Fryer's book, Staying Power, in your own, which
Mm.
kind of talks about how Black people have been in Britain for centuries, and yet that migration is framed, by the elite, by the media, as though it was this kind of recent and sort of alarming phenomenon. How much do you think the fostering or the fostering of anti-immigrant sentiment relies on a lack of education sort of amongst the general populace about Britain's like colonial history?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the lack of education is part of the fostering of that sentiment. Almost like the causality is kind of almost in the other direction. It's not so much that
Mm,
anti-immigration sentiment like capitalizes on the lack of knowledge. The lack of knowledge is a kind of intended, I understand it to be an intended strategy to
mm,
ensure that racialized people broadly can never truly kind of get the sense of belonging, or even if you do, that can be kind of disrupted at any term.
yeah.
So yeah, I definitely think that kind of campaigns and efforts and projects to kind of expand the curriculum to ensure that there's a more accurate representation of what Britain's history really is important. But I'm also kind of tentative and unsure about whether this government or any government would really be that invested in that process,
Mm,
because you would then be giving people the tools and knowledge to understand inequality writ large in this country, which could and should kind of provoke real kind of revolution, as knowledge and education does have that power. So yeah, I think ensuring that people know the true history of this country is an important thing. I don't know that the state is going to make that happen for us. I think we might have to kind of continue to have our own kind of grassroots educational and political educational programs to ensure that we learn and disseminate that knowledge.
mm. You talk a bit about the foundational myth of meritocracy, right? How that's deeply embedded in the British psyche.
Mm.
And it's quite an insidious idea that, if you just work hard enough, then you can make it. And you've already alluded to how there is, that bringing economic benefits is often like a requirement of migrants to even be tolerated in the economy and in society. So could you say a bit more about how this myth of meritocracy actually impacts on the lived experiences of migrants and racialized people?
I think it poses a different burden, which continues to create this artificial distinction between people that are born in this country, I mean, not even people that are born in this country, because people that are born in this country are still, racialized and
Mm.
targeted, but white people who are born in this country and who fit into the specific vision that the state has for itself are kind of told that they're in this different category. So if you come to this country, or if your family came to this country, there's this idea that you somehow have an obligation to kind of pay it back, or, as you say, contribute. Whereas, contrary to that, I would argue that for the vast majority of people coming to this country, particularly from the global south and formerly colonized countries, and we know that Britain has invaded, or kind of interfered in 90% of the countries in the world, those people have actually an entitlement to the wealth and the riches of colonialism and the wealth that's been hoarded up in this country through Britain's kind of various exploits. So it's interesting, this idea that if you're coming to this country from a place which, Britain has marauded and restructured and plunged into debt and disrupted government structures and, dismantled or made it very difficult to practice religions and cultural practices and languages, the idea that you would have to come here and then contribute to the hub of that place that has done that to the place you've come from, it's kind of illogical as a baseline, but it feeds in very much to narratives around the fictional idea that people come to the country to be a drain on resources, whereas we very much, and that narrative around, no, I'm a migrant, I actually contribute, is almost a direct response to that myth of being a drain on resources, which we just know that not to be true. And I suppose that's a difficulty of when you respond directly to a piece of racist rhetoric by trying to present a kind of logical rebuttal.
Mm.
You get looped into a kind of slightly illogical narrative, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose there's always a danger of falling into the trap of trying to demonstrate the economic or the business case for,
Yeah,
migration, and actually that's feels like a bit of a cul-de-sac at best.
definitely. I mean, sometimes it for sure serves a strategic purpose, especially when you're dealing with the government that we have at the moment, who only really cares about the figures and only really cares about profit. If you're trying to make material changes to people's lives, one example off the top of my head is that the fee to register your child as a British citizen is like £1,000 at the moment,
Mm.
and there's bits of kind of strategic litigation happening to try and stop that, because it's clearly very discriminatory. You could very much make the business case that if a family is destitute, for example, and doesn't have any leave to remain, if a child can get their citizenship and the family can get leave to be in the country, then they can then access mainstream welfare support, rather than having to local councils having to provide piecemeal support over long periods of time, which will total up to more than the £1,000 fee. So there's moments, I suppose, where the monetary case is an avenue that will improve people's lives in the here and now. But I agree with you that as a longer term strategy, I think it leads us down to a bit of a dead end of like atomizing specific instances and people's experiences without really tackling the root issue of the kind of inherent racism of the border and of border restrictions themselves.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'd be interested to talk just briefly about the media, in the role the media plays in building borders, because you have a section of the book on that, and you discuss how, either it often reinforces racialized tropes on the one hand, and then there was also a section on the way in which, how it reports on stories like the refugee crisis,
Mm,
how events are conveyed through a human interest angle that never calls into question structural inequality. So
yeah.
yeah, I was just interested if you could say a little bit more about anything that stands out to you about, the media's role.
I mean, I think it's an ongoing question for me as someone who is a writer and has done bits of kind of journalism. I think it's hard to pitch a story about structural inequality. There's not many kind of visuals for it. I mean, the way that the
Mm,
media works at the moment, people will always ask, what's the, as you say, the human interest angle, who's going to be the specific family that you're interviewing, and yeah, that can take you down a route of almost suggesting that there are these kind of anomalous, terrible instances, but that the structure in itself is fine, and that, things like the Windrush scandal is the structure not working as it should, or the system not working as it should. I mean, even just the framing of the Windrush scandal, which kind of came around 2017, 2018, the idea of it being a scandal is interesting because there's actually such a long trajectory of targeted deportations of people from the Windrush countries, of Caribbean people, Caribbean elders, that it almost invisibilizes the larger issue. And the fact that, politicians across the spectrum, including the very departments that were seeking to kind of have these net removal targets, were saying, these mealy mouthed apologies of, this is awful and this is almost like a glitch in the system.
Mm.
And I think that rhetoric of the framing of it as a scandal, as opposed to like, no, this is border controls. Like, this is how it works. This is how
Yeah.
the border works. It's never fair because the border itself is inherently unfair. It's hard when you're trying to kind of get these buzzy phrases that are going to capture public interest, but without kind of obfuscating the broader issue. I think
Mm.
capturing that nuance when we have this like 24-hour news cycle of like short tweets and people just reading headlines and then retweeting the article when they haven't even read it, but they've just read the headline. It's really hard to get that nuance. And I don't think I've arrived at like a solution or an idea of what the alternative is. But I suppose it's maybe the types of stories that are being used to illuminate kind of what it really means to migrate and what it means to be part of a migrant community in this country. We don't see a load of like high profile news stories about migrant communities, working class people standing shoulder to shoulder in like labor struggles, which we know there's a long history of in this country. Like, we don't see those types of stories which actually represent the massive amount of solidarity and commonality between people kind of classed as migrants and non-migrants. We see these very kind of essentializing and sensationalizing stories because that's what gets clicks and sells papers.
Mm. And I suppose to add to that, I guess there's very rarely a sense of the agency of the people,
Mm,
who are, drown in the Mediterranean or who are trafficked. They're
mhm.
usually just portrayed as victims. And
Yeah, I mean, we definitely saw that with the 39 people who died in Essex in the lorry containers. Um,
mm,
I think it was Priti Patel was very kind of quick to. She was very careful about how she said it on Twitter, but very quick to kind of say, human trafficking is terrible and we need to crack down on it. It was a couple of hours after, or very soon after the lorry had been discovered, that there could not have possibly been enough intel to
mm,
say whether this was what is, defined as a trafficking case. There's very specific criteria when it comes to trafficking. Actually, a lot of what we're talking about is like um, labor exploitation when we're talking about things like what the government has framed as modern slavery.
yeah.
If you delve a bit into some of the other news stories around that case of the 39 people who died in Essex, it wasn't that they were, kidnapped out of their beds in the middle of the night and like dragged across the border. That's not to say, of course, by any means that they agreed to die. That's absolutely not what the case was. But what they didn't need was the person driving the lorry to be like thrown in prison and that solves the problem. Actually, the site of violence in that story is the border itself.
Mm,
If the border didn't exist, then those people could have come to the country for their various reasons, but instead they died because they had to take, this informal route because there was no other way to get here. And the pivoting of that news story about it being about trafficking rather than it being about, the border regime is killing people because people can't cross the border safely, um, was a very kind of strategic choice that I didn't really see the media kind of unpacking because, yeah, stories about trafficking are very kind of sensational and interesting, whereas stories about people dying because they come into contact with border violence don't really fit the government agenda in the same way.
mm. Yeah, absolutely. You've kind of answered the next question, which is, we often see this argument presented that harder borders are supposed to act as a deterrent to, people trafficking, and
Mm.
therefore reduce violence or extreme exploitation. But the reality is really the opposite, that they create the conditions for exploitation. And so, I'll ask the question anyway, do harder borders make for effective borders?
I think, well, I suppose it depends on what like effect you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I
But
guess.
I think there's definitely this rhetoric when we're talking about something like modern slavery and, the Modern Slavery Act, which was brought about by Theresa May. And, she's saying that we need to, border force need to work closely and crack down on these gangmasters, these poor people that are being trafficked and enslaved. There's a particular rhetoric of, and this is by no means to say that, trafficking and labor exploitation isn't bad. Of course it is. And of course, the remedies to that are about workers' rights and making sure that people have recourse when they are exploited and when they do have terrible working conditions, that they can access recourse in those situations.
Yeah.
But there's this rhetoric of vulnerability and protection, which I think are used to both mask and also enable the exploitation of people crossing state borders. And I think a certain element of that is very dehumanizing. There's a very intentional dehumanization and infantilization that happens when people's agency is very purposefully stripped away through language and through policy and through laws. And the tragic death of 39 people in the lorry container in Essex, as I've mentioned, is an example of that. What happens here, rather than seeing that the vulnerability is produced in the upholding of the border, the vulnerability is seen as something, perhaps pathological or inherent about the person who crosses the border, which of course means that the state then kind of gives itself a mandate to swoop in as their guardian and decide what's best for them. Even though a person who has raised thousands of pounds to make a very dangerous trip to the UK clearly has a very clear grasp of strategy and resource management, decision making. That's not
Hmm.
something obviously that you just do on a whim. I don't think it's likely that people want to be, pulled out of the things that they've paid lots of money to kind of cross borders, and their communities got behind them and loaned them money and they've crossed the border. I don't necessarily think that they would want the government to say, okay, we're going to pluck you out of this situation, give you 45 days or whatever it is to like reflect and recover, and then we're going to deport you to the
Hmm.
place that you've just spent like your whole family's life savings on coming from. Because what that doesn't do is address the material circumstances that has led to that person making the decision based on, being an expert on their own life, that this is the best choice for them. It doesn't address poverty, it doesn't address structural inequality and global inequality. It just plucks that person out of that one situation where they weren't able to report that their boss hadn't paid them for a month, or report the fact that they were being expected to live in a room with 10 people, or report the fact that their passport had been taken away from them. It doesn't address any of those issues. It just kind of covers it up, sweeps it under the rug, and dissolves that very specific incidence of exploitation without addressing the larger structure that has led to that, really.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. So, what are some of the ways then in which borders are, increasingly enacted beyond the physical barrier, right, beyond the fence or wall at, airports, other points of entry to the country? Because there's been this creep recently, hasn't there,
Mm.
into all walks of life, and there's kind of an expectation that loads of different kinds of people will be policing the border. So yeah, could you say a bit more about how we've witnessed this kind of creep?
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. I mean, as you said, we've seen, particularly in the last decade, kind of via the 2014 and 2016 immigration acts, the ramping up of what we might refer to as everyday borders. So, very much as you say, rather than the border just being reinforced at the periphery or at a port of entry, we see people within our communities being turned into de facto border guards by these immigration laws. So, for example, we know that there's a piece of legislation which came in 2014, 2015, called Right to Rent, which means that landlords now have to check ID documents for tenants or lodgers, or they could risk a fine or jail time. And in practice, what this means is landlords are less likely to rent to people who don't have a British passport or kind of straightforward documentation proving their right to reside, or perhaps any documentation at all. And in research carried out by the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, because of right to rent, over a quarter of landlords that they surveyed would be reluctant to rent to somebody with, I quote, a foreign sounding name. So this is kind of one example of the border being reinforced from within the country. And, whether it's a landlord or a estate agent, as much as we politically might not like those people anyway, they are being turned into, in addition to the terrible things they might already do, they're being turned into border guards. And we see this in other places as well. So there's, immigration checks and charges for secondary care and healthcare settings, which includes things like people giving birth, and the sharing of data also between healthcare and the Home Office, although this has been reduced through the Patients Not Passports campaign, which everybody should check out if you don't know about that already. But in practice, what this means is that people are scared to access healthcare, or they simply can't afford to access it, or they're, accumulating huge debts and being slapped with these bills after perhaps having like very big traumatic procedures, surgery or giving birth, and then having this massive bill to pay. And we see the same types of checks and barriers in educational settings, and when people are trying to set up bank accounts, and lots of other places. And I guess one other example just to flag is, since 2012, a no recourse to public funds condition has been routinely imposed on all migrants who are granted the legal right to live and work in the UK, which is called limited leave to remain. And it's a condition that's placed on most people's limited leave to remain, which basically prohibits them from accessing public funds such as local authority housing, universal credit, housing benefit, child benefit, that kind of thing, personal independence payments. And what it means is, if you're struggling to get by, or if you aren't working, or you're not allowed to work, or you can't pay your rent, particularly in the pandemic, we've seen a lot of people really falling on hard times, you end up facing destitution and homelessness because you can't access any state support. So the NRPF condition basically locks people out of society and makes it really impossible to get by, and contributes to what we were talking earlier about, this kind of two-tier system where there's this kind of big chunk of people who are basically living on this kind of precarious high cliff with their NRPF condition. And if, they lose their job, or in a pandemic, perhaps you are being supported by people from your church and now they can't be giving you money anymore, you find yourself right at the edge of that cliff, kind of looking into an abyss where there's no welfare safety net underneath. And that's very much the hostile environment at play, which of course was Theresa May's stated aim in 2012, to kind of make life for migrant communities pretty untenable.
And I suppose the stated aim of the border regime is to sort of act as a deterrent. But one thing that emerges in the book is there's a little bit of a contradiction with that, and then the reality of some things like immigration detention centres, being placed out in the sticks, or deportation chartered flights like taking place in the dead of night, to avoid scrutiny. So is there another logic at play behind the expansion of the border regime and the prison industrial complex, which is something else that you talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a real contradiction, as you say, in the fact that a lot of the aspects of the border regime are allegedly about making Britain not look like an appealing place to come, that it's not going to be an easy ride. I think definitely the other side of that is that borders, kind of all aspects of the border, whether that's deportations or immigration detention, which are run by these kind of private outsourced companies like Serco and G4S and Taskor and GEO Group, they all exist to make profit. So, as deportations, for example, have increased in the past couple of decades, so too have the profits being made by the companies who carry them out. So the current, I think it's £525 million contract to provide guards to escort people who are being deported is held by an outsourcing company called Mighty. And then there's other companies making profits off deportations, obviously including the airlines that carry them out, such as British Airways, EasyJet, Qatar Airways and Turkish Airlines. Actually, the only airline carrier to have publicly committed although the follow through is unclear, to ceasing deportations from the UK is Virgin Airlines after kind of long campaign by different grassroots groups. But kind of furthermore, in order to further facilitate the deportation of people from the UK into purpose-built prisons outside the country, and you mentioned the prison industrial complex, this web of structures and bodies, which includes prisons and policing and tagging and surveillance and deportation. In recent years, the UK government has actually made plans to build prisons in its former colonies, such as Jamaica and Nigeria. So, in a visit to Jamaica in 2015, David Cameron announced his plans to spend millions of pounds of aid money on building a prison in Jamaica where people living in Britain can be sent to serve prison sentences. And then a couple of years later, Boris Johnson said that he was going to make this agreement between the UK and Nigeria, meaning that people in prison in Nigeria and the UK can be returned to complete their sentences in their respective countries. So almost like a kind of prisoner swap system. And the UK government was going to build this. I think they've gone ahead with that, actually, this 112-bed wing in a prison in Lagos. So you see how Britain's border and the regime of detention and deportation dovetails with the prison industrial complex very much. And we've seen that really ramping up in the way that people might, be locked up in prison for a certain amount of years. And then once they've been released from prison, then transferred to immigration detention and automatically considered for deportation. There's a very kind of smooth transition between those two aspects of the prison industrial complex, and it's absolutely tied up in money making and those private companies that are profiting from those systems.
It'd be good to talk a little bit about the actual conditions inside these places, because I guess it's worth pointing out that on the one hand, although, as you say in the book, it's often framed as this administrative or like legal process, and yet it's clearly criminalizing because, many of these detention centres are housed in former high security prisons.
Yeah.
I grew up in Dorset. The Verne on Portland used to be a
Yeah, of
prison,
course.
then it was a detention centre, and now it's a prison again.
Yeah.
So, there's clearly, that's not a coincidence. But what are the similarities between immigration detention with prison, and where are the departures between the two? Because I think you mention some interesting ways in the book.
The conditions within detention centres are pretty bad, as reported by people inside them. The food that's provided to people who are locked up is of very poor quality, often very kind of repetitive, chips 3 times a day, chips and rice as a meal. It's not nutritious. Access to healthcare is very bad. There's a real kind of culture of disbelief within the detention system. So when people are reporting different healthcare concerns, they're told, just take paracetamol, like irrespective of what it is. People with really high blood pressure just being told, take paracetamol until they're, bleeding from the nose, and then finally perhaps the guards take it seriously. Even then, if they do get a doctor's appointment, they have to wear handcuffs to attend those appointments. So people are really reluctant to report quite serious issues because they don't want to be, taken in handcuffs outside of the centre and into a doctor's surgery. That's a very kind of humiliating way for a person to be treated. In terms of the similarities, I don't know how similar this would be actually. It depends on the prison itself, but in immigration detention, if you have a smartphone, you can't have that in the centre. So you'd get that taken off you and you'd be given a very simple like brick phone that doesn't have any internet access or a camera. And journalists can't go inside detention centres. They're very kind of shadowy places. There's a real lack of scrutiny. There's a really limited amount of people who can actually go in there and see what the conditions are in a kind of scrutinizing capacity. One of the significant differences that are often reported by people in detention, particularly if they've been in prison and then they've been in immigration detention, is that in prison you have a release date. So typically you're told this is how long you're going to be in here, and people kind of count down the days. Whereas in immigration detention, Britain is the only country in Europe to detain people for immigration purposes indefinitely. So you are kind of counting up the days, is what people say, which takes a real toll on people's mental health if you have absolutely no idea when you're going to leave that place, whether it's going to be 1 month or 3 years. That's really really has a very negative impact, and we see that reflected in high rates of self-harm and suicide and deaths in detention, kind of comparative to the non-detained population.
Mm. Makes for grim reading,
Mm.
definitely. And I want us to talk a little bit about some of the ways in which people can act in solidarity a bit later on in the discussion.
Mm.
Um, I guess just to change tack a little bit, and this is sort of a standing question on these podcasts, regardless of the subject, but I think you'd written much of the book before the pandemic hit.
Mm.
And I was just wondering how the pandemic has shifted things in relation to the border regime.
Mm.
Has it reinforced its logic of exclusion? Has it created any openings? Yeah, just interested in how the last year has played out in relation to what you write about in the book.
Yeah, it was very interesting to see how, I mean, interesting in a incredibly dark way to see how the virus spread between cities, and the kind of story of inequality that tells us. It wasn't working class, low income, or undocumented people from the global south who were flying around the world in, April, May, June, July last year who spread the virus. From the pattern of the spread, we can maybe infer that it was people from the global north exercising their privilege or their ability to move and go where they want. And that very much played a role in spreading the virus, as it seemed to catch hold and spike the quickest in cities that are these international travel hubs and centres of business like New York, Milan, Paris, London, and so on. And of course, there are other factors at play, like the median age of different populations around the world and that kind of thing. But I think it's a very clear example of who gets to border cross and move between cities, and who then experiences the sharp edge of immigration policies that map out who can and can't be mobile in that same way. I think that was one of the most kind of noticeable things for me at the beginning of the pandemic. I mean, other smaller but like still very important things is the way that some of the way that the border regime and the kind of immigration system in this country strategically makes itself very difficult to navigate, almost as if like, well, that's the only way it can function. You have to go to Liverpool if you want to apply for this thing, or you have to go to Croydon if you want to get this document. Whereas we've seen in the pandemic that, oh, surprisingly, everything can be done online, and like things can be done by Zoom.
Mm.
um, and there's very much that tension within the no borders movement of like the onward march to abolish borders, whilst also recognizing that, a politics of inclusion and finding ways for people to get their papers and to get access to mainstream welfare systems and things like that are very important material changes that need to happen. So seeing that those systems can actually be navigated more easily, the pandemic has shown that systems can be adapted and they can be done online without people having to like bring all of their life's documents to a center in one specific city in the country. I think that's had a material positive impact on people's lives, as alongside that we continue to kind of march forwards and ensure that people don't need citizenship in order to access the things they want, but in the here and now, that's one of the routes available to people.
Hmm. Definitely want to talk about no borders a little bit more in a minute, because I imagine many of our listeners will already be advocates of like a border abolition position, although some people might sympathize with it and think perhaps it's a bit unrealistic or utopian. But I really love the final section of the book because it takes
Mm,
apart a lot of the common arguments against abolition, or a lot of the worries, I suppose.
mm,
So I thought it might be interesting to just actually delve into a few of those common arguments or common questions here,
mm,
because you pose them in the book
yeah.
in the concluding section, and I would just be interested to hear you answer those questions. So let me start with this one, which is: won't relaxing borders and therefore introducing a larger migrant workforce drive down wages and ruin the economy?
I mean, I think it's part of what we were kind of speaking a bit about earlier, the idea that migrant workers have always been very much at the forefront of struggles for improving working conditions in this country, whether it's like, the Grunwick strike, or, women in Yarlswood getting paid £1 an hour to do the exact types of labour that they were criminalised and detained for doing outside of detention. I think the finger to be pointed about things like wages being driven down is the people who control the wages. It's always going to be the bosses and the people who are, regulating minimum wages. It's not workers who are setting those bars. So yeah, I think that maybe the quick answer is around if people are concerned about working conditions or about their own personal working conditions, joining a union or kind of organizing collectively with your fellow workers, whether they are documented or undocumented, is going to be where you're going to gather the most power. It's not going to be about saying that certain people can't come into the country or can't come into certain industries.
Okay, next question from the end of the book is, what about the strain on the National Health Service?
Yeah, that's a common one. I think it's a similar one in that it's a bit of a misdirection. A lot of the strain on the National Health Service has been around kind of chronic underfunding by the government of the NHS. That's what's led to, longer waiting times and not enough beds and understaffing and incredible stress being placed on staff. Again, I'm reluctant to do that thing that we were talking about earlier of responding to a question that itself isn't particularly sensical. But typically people that cross borders and come to this country are less likely to actually access the National Health Service than people who are already here. So the idea that there's a disproportionate strain doesn't really stack up. Of course, people who come here, everybody who lives here, whether they're documented or not, should be able to access healthcare. That's a kind of basic fundamental, I think. But the questions around the problems that are being faced by the NHS at the moment, we should again point those questions directly at the government that funds it or doesn't fund it and ask them to sort it out.
Okay, cool. Next question. How would we keep out all the terrorists and criminals?
I think I always kind of try and unpick this question a little bit by unpicking the idea of criminalisation. So the types of acts and groups of people that are disproportionately criminalised, we know are often working class, disproportionately people of colour, who are racialised, including in stop and searches, which then funnels people into prison for what are termed minor offences. We can ask questions about why do people have to break the law in some instances? Is it because they don't have access to proper, housing, to employment opportunities, to mental health care? All of these things, if we tackle the root causes of the drivers of law breaking, that's more likely to get us to a more kind of robust and rigorous solution than this kind of specious idea that it's people crossing a border and coming to the country that are disproportionately breaking the law, which they aren't. On the question of terrorism, I think research shows that terrorists are the majority of people who've done things which are termed as terrorism in this country are born here, are British. So if that's something that concerns you, kind of the border isn't, or reinforcing the border any more than it already is, which I don't know how you would do that, isn't going to stop that happening. Again, I think the kind of more radical approach is looking at why are those people doing those things and are there any solutions that you can present that are going to stop them happening, rather than after the fact punishing people or irrelevantly stopping people from coming to the country just because you've profiled them as being somehow in some kind of public imagination more likely to do something which is framed as a terrorist act.
Yeah, definitely. All right, just a couple more on this thread, but
I'm enjoying this pop quiz.
yeah, it's a bit different. So we've touched a little bit on this already in terms of modern slavery, but the next question is, if we relax borders, won't that only encourage more people trafficking?
Yeah, as we've kind of discussed a bit earlier, the harms and the violence of things like trafficking can only exist or are much more likely to exist if you have a border that somebody can be trafficked across, in the sense that if you have a border that says that certain groups of people can't come here, or if you don't have enough money, you can't come here because you can't afford to, buy property here or buy a visa or however that works. If you removed those restrictions, there would be no there wouldn't be that border for a person to be trafficked across. A lot of the issue or the problem with people who are in situations of labour exploitation when they come to the country, a lot of the remedies for those situations are about improving workers' rights and ensuring that people, whether it's if they're experiencing harassment at work or they're being asked to do things that they didn't agree to do, or their living conditions are terrible, or they're not being given any breaks, or their working conditions are detrimental to their health. If people aren't documented, it's difficult for them to find ways to remedy those situations. Whereas if we removed the border, not just in the sense of like the fence around the country, but the whole idea of the border, the idea that if you're not documented, you can't access public services, you can't report things to the police because they're going to report you to the Home Office should you want to report to the police. If you remove all of those barriers, then actually the vulnerability that's produced through the border and through border enforcement then reduces, and the issue of trafficking is kind of remedied through those means.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so last one of these. Britain's already too full. Where would everybody live?
Yeah, this was actually a question that was asked by someone close to me. They were worried that, I think the phrase they used was, you can't fit more than a pint in a pint jar. This idea that like Britain is bursting to the seams. And it's just kind of factually not true. Like over half of Britain is like woodland and grassland and kind of agricultural land. There's definitely enough room for lots more people to come to the country. We have a massive housing crisis in the country at the moment. That's not because there's not enough room. It's not even because there's not enough houses. It's because there's a real inequality of access to those houses. And we've seen over the past few decades the kind of systematic selling off of social housing stock through various kind of capitalist schemes, money-making schemes, which has meant that, local authorities have this tens of thousands long lists of people waiting for social housing, council properties, having to enter the private rental market, which in itself is, incredibly extortionate and a rip-off and very precarious. So the issue presented is kind of a false one. It's not, we're not struggling for space right now. It's more that the ideology that's underpinned what we're now living in, the housing crisis, needs to be addressed and kind of pushed back against so that everybody can access kind of safe, comfortable and affordable housing.
Well, hopefully people will, if they weren't already a bit more convinced of the no borders position, will have found that enlightening. That was Leah Cowan, author of Border Nation. If you're enjoying this discussion and want to keep listening, then head over to patreon.com, where patrons can access the full, unabridged version of this and other episodes of the podcast. A reminder, of course, that listeners can get an exclusive 50% off the book through plutobooks.com for the next month. Just use the coupon podcast at the checkout. We'll be back next month with another episode of Radicals in Conversation, so until then, thanks very much for listening and goodbye.